Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mazviita Chirimuuta. She is a senior lecturer in philosophy in the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. And today we're focusing on her second book, the most recent one, The Brain Abstracted, Simplification in the History and Philosophy of Neuroscience. And she has another book also titled Outside Color, Perceptual Science and the Puzzle of Color in Philosophy. So Dr. Chirimuuta, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to be here.
So, what is the main argument that you put forth in your book? And what exactly is this idea of simplification in science and more specifically in neuroscience?
Yeah, well, the main argument in the book, I'll talk about that first. There's an overarching narrative of the book, which I think in the context of philosophy of neuroscience, it makes sense to think a bit about where philosophy of neuroscience originated as an academic field. So it started in the 1980s through work of people like Paul and Patricia Churchland, who developed this research program called neurophilosophy. I believe you've had Patricia Churchland on your podcast,
twice.
Right? Yeah. So the aim of neurophilosophy was to look at all of these exciting new results in neuroscience and see if they could be applied to long-standing questions within the philosophy of mind, say about the nature of consciousness, what is perception, what is decision-making, do we have free will? So the idea was that the results of neuroscience would be telling us something significant and quite readily interpretable to philosophers concerning the nature of cognition, the nature of the brain states which give rise to mental states. My overarching argument in the book is that there's a problem inherent to neurophilosophy, given that it's typical and unavoidable in scientific practice to simplify the subject matter that they're investigating. So we'll talk more about simplification as we go on in this interview with examples and so forth. But the point is that the slogan, if you like, is the brain is far more complex than can be represented in any one particular scientific model or theory. So when neuroscientists give us a model or an account of what decision-making is, what free will might be, what perception is, this is always going to be a drastic simplification of the actual complexity of the brain states which give rise to cognition. So given this mismatch between the actual complexity of the brain and the simplified scientific representations, we can't just take neuroscience and say, this is directly applicable to the questions that we have in philosophy of mind, to the things that we want to ask about how the brain gives rise to cognition and therefore what cognition essentially is.
So I have a very interesting quote here from the book. At a certain point you say, as irreligious and self-avowedly naturalistic science and philosophy of science were in the century after Nietzsche, the basics of the belief system were not updated. Beauty, truth, and parsimony were left high on their pedestal. So could you explain this? Because particularly the second bit about beauty, truth, and parsimony, I found really interesting.
Yeah. So this is from the preface of the book. So I was being a little bit condensed and not exactly explaining everything going on in the background with those ideas. So I do argue in the introduction to the book that one of the reasons for the conviction that many scientists have that when they develop a simplified theory or model, that this is discovering something inherently simple about the natural world. I argue that this has some roots in the theological background to science. So as many historians of science have noticed, science didn't just spring up independently in a cultural vacuum. The original scientists were what's known as natural philosophers, people like Newton, and Galileo, of course, even though he's always presented as having this big dispute with the church, he was interested in natural philosophy and ultimately theology as well. So people were motivated to study the natural world in order to find out about God through God's works. So natural philosophy and natural theology were interconnected disciplines. And one of the reasons people had the conviction, and early on in the development of science, that by finding simplicity in nature, that you would learn something about God's mind, was coming from this idea that God worked in a way that was rationally intelligible, simple, God has a simple, eternal, unchangeable nature. All of these sort of notions that come quite directly from monotheism found their way as part of the motivation for scientists to seek simplicity in nature. And but it's more specifically on that quotation you just read out. The thing at the back of my mind was actually Nietzsche's criticism of Plato. So Nietzsche, obviously thought a lot about the history of religion and how that connected with the history of science and a history of philosophy. He very much emphasized that Christianity was a version of Platonism, like a popularized version of Platonism. And a core tenet of the Platonic theory was that the world that we see around us in nature, the world of appearances, is somehow illusory, but the underlying reality is simple, eternal, unchanging. This is the world of the forms. So there's a way of thinking about Platonism which tells us even if nature seems complex, it's not complex really. Underlying nature are these simple, eternal forms and laws of nature. And you can see how that connects with how scientists have tried to investigate nature, sort of breaking down the data sets, which seem to be really messy and complicated, and looking for underlying patterns which are very intelligible and fixed. So Nietzsche's, if you like, criticism of Plato was that there's something kind of self-deceptive about that Platonic account of knowledge, which is to say that what Plato thought he was doing is saying, knowledge is just this contemplation, this disinterested discovery about how nature is, that it's not connected with our human purposes and like kind of low desires just to get stuff and change things to how it suit us. And he said that was self-deceptive because ultimately what knowledge is directed to is will to power, is getting more stuff that we want, is furthering our own like almost selfish desires. And what I'm saying in that little snippet is that actually if we look at science, when we think that science is just telling us about how nature operates in this kind of disinterested way, we should actually remember that what science is doing in the world today is very much connected with technology. It's very much connected with how people want to, could be in a good sense, like cure diseases, or it could be just purely economic gain, but it's connected with, if you like, human desires and ambitions. Mm-hmm. So when we think of science as just like idealistically trying to achieve a view of the world which combines beauty, truth, and parsimony, simplicity instead of goodness, we should remember actually there's some more like low-level ambitions there.
Right. No, I to be honest, I really had to include this quote here in our conversation because I'm quite fond of Nietzsche's philosophy, and I've interviewed many Nietzsche scholars for the show. So I thought that it would make for for some good observations here about science and related topics. So
I mean, certainly, I think he's right to like look at him like with Heidegger as this prophet for the technological age, whether you have a positive or negative view on that. And I think there's a lot of insights into our like current technological situation that we can get from reading Nietzsche. And I think he's not so distant from a lot of other ideas in current analytic philosophy of science, because there's been this big pragmatist turn. People are, not just me, plenty of philosophers of science are looking at how science is connected with technology and And you can see parallels between what Nietzsche said and then slightly following him, the American pragmatists. So really criticizing this view of knowledge as purely disinterested.
Right. So nowadays we hear a lot about big data, data science, stuff like that. And in the book you also talk at a certain point about a contention between what you call a classical scientific approach and a data-driven engineering approach. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the classical scientific approach, you can think of that as a manifestation of this Platonic ideal, which says that a scientific theory should be intelligible to the person that develops it. It should take a subset of the data that it's possible to arrive at, relevant to a particular phenomenon, and gets, if you like, to the core essential heart of what is underlying that data set. For example, a law of nature which can be used to predict the data set. And when you have that, if you like, essential set of principles which underlie your data set, the idea is that this is, for all time and space, going to be the same principle that will explain any kind of data set anywhere else in the natural world relevant to this particular philosophy. So you have this combination of like the intelligibility of these principles to the scientist and the conviction that these principles will extrapolate, extend anywhere else that the scientist might want to apply them. So that's, I think, essential to this classical approach. But what you see in data-driven science is that you really dial down your ambition for the intelligibility of the model that you're going to generate on the basis of your data sets. You're ending up with mathematically much more complex models using machine learning, which you can use to predict items in your distribution, but you're not going to have a clear-cut set of principles or laws of nature which help you have that sense of really understanding what's going on in the world. So that you know, that nice subjective feeling of I really figured out how this phenomenon works. You have less of that, and you're kind of reliant on your data set being based on when you have a novel data set, you're reliant on the new data being within the same distribution of your original data set that model was originally based on. So you kind of give up on that conviction that you can extrapolate for all time and place.
So we're going to get back to simplicity in a second, but since your book is focused on neuroscience specifically, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges with the study of the brain? And why is the brain, at least apparently, so complex?
Yeah. So when we're talking about the complexity of an object, and I'm not a complexity scientist myself. I talk a bit in the introduction of the book about definitions of complexity that come from complexity science and how they relate a bit to what I'm doing. But this is just a sort of layman's to complexity science take here, and some ideas that are relevant is that when you have a complex system, you have a lot of heterogeneity of the parts. So if you break the system down into parts and look what the different individual components are, they'll be very different among themselves. And they'll also tend not to be stable or fixed in their properties. So the parts can not only be various, but they can also be variable across time. And they'll be densely interacting with one another. So it means that what happens over here in one part of the system can affect in many different ways what's going over here in another part of the system. So if you look at the brain, you see all of those things to a high degree. So there are very many different neuronal types within the brain. Neuroanatomists classify neuron types into different sorts, like you have pyramidal cells or Purkinje cells, and they have a overall morphology which is recognizable. But if you look in the details, even one individual neuron looks a bit different from another. It's like trees in a forest with a branching structure, means that each neuron has it's a bit like people, individual characteristics. And these are thought to be functionally relevant as well, because the different branching structures is connectivity with other neurons around them. Neurons are interconnected with one another to a high degree. There's this very, trillions of synapses, like the connecting junctions within the brain. We should also not forget that neurons aren't the only type of the brain. You also have these other cells called glial cells, which used to be thought of as just like they're supporting the neurons, but actually they seem to have a role in cognition, except most people don't study them, so we know relatively little about them. And if we talk about sort of variability across time from one day or month to the next, the brain is also changing all the time. So when we form memories, what's happening is the brain is plastic. It's altering the connections between the neurons. It's altering things about the physiology of those neurons as well. So so this inherent changeability is this challenge for the scientific ambition in the classical sense of just finding fixed properties of a system which will always allow you to predict what will happen.
And on the topic of simplification, you talk about mainly three different simplification or simplifying strategies in neuroscience. One of them is mathematization, another is reduction, and the third one is the formation of analogies between the complicated and familiar neural system and the simpler and more familiar artifact. Could you explain them? I mean, reduction, I guess that I've already talked about on the show. It's a quite common topic, but particularly the other two, if you could explain them.
Yeah, mathematization. So the quite basic thought here is that when you take an object in the natural world and describe it in mathematical terms with numbers and the relationships between those numbers, what you're doing is you're abstracting away from most of the properties of an object. So if I look at the things around me, it's not on camera, but I've got some plants around me. It has a whole bunch of qualitative properties, like it's got the color of the leaves, the different leaves have different shapes to them. But if you're representing mathematically, you might just say, I'm going to count the number of leaves. I'm just going to measure the leaves. So you're sort of you're converting all of those sort of rich, kind of unique set of properties that I might find in as I look at the thing, and saying, okay, what matters is just a few numerical variables. So that's leaving behind a lot of the complexity that is there in the natural world. So in the history of science and current day sort of background philosophy of a lot of scientists, there's this idea that all of those qualitative details of what's there in an object in the natural world are somehow irrelevant to how it's operating fundamentally. And I think this again goes back to this Platonic tradition. So if you think about what Plato said about the world, he was almost, there's things that approach this idea that the maths, geometry is more real than what we experience of the world through our senses. So underlying this imperfect, messy, not hard to define sensory world of appearances, there is a geometric structure underlying everything. So when scientists mathematize, I think they often think to themselves, well, we're just getting to the essences, with the essential properties of what's there. But what I'm saying is that actually they're using a simplifying strategy. All of those details are there in the real object in the natural world, whether it's a plant or someone's brain. And maybe those details do matter to what that object essentially is as a living thing. You mentioned that reduction is often talked about, because reductionism is one of those words that has a bad name almost in biology, but it's been a very useful strategy. I mean, all it means is instead of trying to take a whole organism or a whole organ by itself as a whole system, you begin with analyzing the parts, the building blocks, with the hope or expectation that by studying those parts, you'll get some insights into the whole. Now, it has limitations because if you study parts in isolation, when you're dealing with a complex system, the parts' behavior will be context dependent, which means that you'll be limited in what you can discover about the parts by looking at them independently of the whole system. So it certainly has its place, certainly with technological ambitions. But yeah, it can't be the whole story about how living organisms work. But yeah, forming analogies, though I write a lot about that in the book, because the notion of the computer as an analogy for what brains are, I'm saying is being hugely influential and dominant in the recent history of neuroscience. So a nice way of thinking about why analogies are important in science is that if we look at the world around us of living objects, they're complex and it's kind of opaque what's going on inside them. Going back to Aristotle, people looked at living objects like and thought about them in terms of, well, the parts of a living object have functions. They're a bit tool-like. So your hand, you might think of it, well, it's like a pincing tool, it's like a grasping tool. There's all of this, if you like, seeming goal-directedness in living objects. And when you make comparisons between living objects or the organs, organ literally means tool, by the way, that's where the word is derived from, a living organ, and you make a comparison with a tool that someone has made, then that gives you like a clue, or maybe I understand how this living organ works if I know the principles of how this artifact, how this tool that someone has made according to their own understanding of physical relationships. Then I think, well, maybe in nature, this is what the principles of operation are behind this organ. So what I'm saying, I mean, analogies don't only figure in biology, but I think they have a very particular role in the biological sciences because of this comparison between like the tool-like nature of many living things and the way that people have built so many different tools and then have ideas about how those work, which then get imported into their understanding of biological items.
Yes, we're going to get back to the computer metaphor of the brain in a bit. But before that, why do scientists seek simplicity? I mean, is this something that is just unavoidable? And what are the goals that they have in mind with simplicity?
Yeah, so this goes back to that divide between Plato and Nietzsche, ultimately. So if you ask a Platonist, broadly speaking, in that broad tradition, why scientists would seek simplicity, they would say, well, because nature inherently is simple. So when you find some simple laws or principles in nature, you have discovered the truth about reality that was hidden before you did your investigation. If you ask a Nietzschean, and this is the camp that I'm in, this is the argument that I'm presenting in this book, I'm saying scientists seek simplicity because they want to control the natural world. Humans are limited in their cognitive capacities. If we try to just take in all of the complexity that's there in nature, like you keep track of all of the different individual items and how they change from day to day and how they interact with one another, we'd just be hopelessly confused. We wouldn't be able to keep track of anything. Human language is itself a simplifying scheme, because when I talk about leaves on this plant next to me, I'm using that one word leaf to apply to all of those items which by themselves are actually have these differences. So I'm saying science kind of exaggerates that. It imposes simplifying schemes on natural objects so that we're not cognitively overloaded and we can focus on certain relationships of dependency, certain causal relationships that people will want to control and manipulate in order to get the results that they want in the world around them.
But I mean, just to clarify one point here, how do you look at that? I mean, do you think about it as simply a limitation, but a sort of unavoidable limitation of even our cognition itself. So there's no problem with that. It's just a matter of scientists being aware of that and in the way that it should weigh on their interpretations of the data and so on. Or is it actually something problematic that we should try to overcome in specific ways?
Yeah, so I think it's more the former. There is an inherent limitation on how much a human being can understand in terms of how many variables in a model they're going to be able to make sense of. Like, we can't think in much more than 3 dimensions because, you know, how our sensory experience of the world is. We live in this 3D space and we have intuitions about 3 dimensions, can kind of stretch it to 4 and 5. When you have a 10 or more dimensional data set, your intuitions about what goes on is going to break down. So I think that is an inherent limitation. But I think that there are some schemas or way of thinking that people use that could be more or less drastically simplified. I actually think that when people use metaphors to understand the world, say in literature, part of the value of metaphorical language can actually be that it kind of encompasses a bit more of the complexity and maybe inherent almost vagueness or changeability of things in nature. So I think as science has become more and more dominant as a way of thinking of the world, it's maybe tempted people to underestimate how much of things in the world around them are complex and interdependent. And there are other ways of thinking, and you can think historically and also cross-culturally, that maybe are more sensitive to that. So I think it's important to be pluralistic. So given that science has to simplify it, we should also say that it's worth also paying value to, even within sciences, different approaches that maybe simplify less drastically, and also outside of science, ways that we can be more sensitive to complexity, even if we can't fully grasp it in all of its details.
You mentioned pluralism there. I want to ask you a specific question about that. So in the book, you take preference for a more pluralist and perspectivist approach to neuroscience, in this case, over a sort of standard scientific realism and empiricism approach. Why and what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so to use our sort of Platonic figurehead again, and again, I don't want to say this is all like stemming from Plato's dialogues down today, but just like following this idea that there is a consistent lineage here. So I'm saying essentially that if you take scientific realism today, there's something Platonic about it. So the mainstream scientific realists, they say our best scientific theories are giving us a representation of how things are in nature, which are not observable to our senses. So a classic example for scientific realism would be to say when a theory in physics posits electrons in order to explain certain phenomena, you know, you might observe electric shocks and things like that. You have good reason to say that those particles, electrons, exist. So they're saying that there is, if you like, a world behind the senses, and that is what the scientists are allowing us to know about. So empiricists, they actually were very resistant to this metaphysical interpretation of science, and they were actually almost a bit Nietzschean here. An empiricist like Ernst Mach, actually, people make a connection between him and Nietzsche, which is interesting. So he's another 19th century scientist and philosopher, and he said, actually, all we have is the world of appearances. We have lots of sensory data. What science is doing is just finding connections between those data and representing them in an economical way. So in this sort of divide between classical scientific realism and empiricism, I'm sort of fairly sympathetic to this empiricist tradition. So I'm saying that, like as Mach said, we shouldn't interpret our scientific theories as like telling us simple laws and principles which exist behind the sensory data. For me, this debate about the existence of particles is not relevant because I'm not talking about physics. I'm talking about objects in biology, which everyone can observe. But the question is, should we be realists in our interpretation of the theories and models that scientists develop? And what I'm saying is that when those theories and models impose simplifications on the observable data that we can encounter regarding those systems, we shouldn't believe that the simplification is more real than the actual observable data. I'm saying that actually nature is irreducibly complex, and for this reason, multiple theoretical approaches are all needed, because if you think of it as a mountain with needing lots of viewpoints on it, there's you can't take in one view all of the complexity, all of the operations that are there in that one system. So you need multiple viewpoints in order for each of them to sort of grasp something about what's going on. So this is what motivates the pluralism. It actually is founded on this idea that underlying everything is just this irreducible complexity, and we can only grasp it in these small piecemeal approaches. If you can think of each approach as like one viewpoint, one perspective on a thing. I know you've had on your podcast Michaela Massimi, who's talked at length on perspectivism, so I'll let your listeners go to that episode to hear more specifically what this notion of perspectivism is.
Yeah, it was a great episode, and I will link to it in the description of this one.
Yeah.
So in the book you go through an example, I guess an illustrative example of an early theory in neuroscience, reflex theory that got very popular, a theory about the organization of the brain and the nervous system that then later was discarded. Could you tell us about it, what reflex theory was and how and why it fell, and perhaps then we can get a better understanding of why it might be illustrative of some of the issues you're pointing to in the book?
Yeah, so the reflex theory, so it was dominant, so just before the start of the 20th century, going into the 1930s. So that's the time period we're talking about. So it arose following some really important discoveries about neurophysiology that happened mid-19th century. So people had theorized about reflex action since the 17th century, since Descartes. But what happened in the 19th century with more detailed probing of the nervous system was that, this is Charles Bell, was one figure that found this, is that people found that there was different nerves that were responsible for sensory input into the spine, and then another set of nerves sort of linked in a arc connected to that, responsible for the motor response, the movement that was would happen in response to the sensory input. So if you think about what reflexes are, like the kneecap reflex that the doctor might do, that's giving you a particular sensory input, and you have this very predictable motor response in reaction to that. Or if someone throws an object towards your eye, you immediately blink, so there's this quick sensory response elicited in the quick motor output. So this idea of sort of decomposing the nervous system into a sensory input side and a motor output side, they would be linked at the spinal cord. This served to explain many behaviors and responses, like the eye blink and the various other reflexes with the limbs. So these were like success stories for neurophysiology at the time. And then what people did is kind of extrapolate from that and say, well, what if everything that the brain and nervous system is doing is actually a kind of reflex response? So what if what's going on in the brain is actually more reflexes coming in, being connected with another set of motor outputs, and then everything that someone says and does might ultimately be decomposable into a set of reflex responses. So what I say in the book, or explain in the book, is that it's a kind of reductionism. So looking at the parts of the nervous system as reflexes. So if you like, it's a physiological part, these isolated sensory motor responses are what the building blocks of the nervous system are. So the thought is, if we just study reflexes, then ultimately we're going to be able to explain more complex behaviors and neural responses. So some of the very major early 20th century neurophysiologists like Charles Sherrington spent a lot of their career studying reflex responses in dogs and cats under certain experimental preparations which were used to kind of generate more predictable reflex like responses. But ultimately, this approach fell out of favor because there were just too many anomalies, too many cases where it just became clear that the reflex theory was not able to explain this universally in neuroscience in the way that people had thought. But I should also mention that there was a lot of overlap in the 20s and 30s that developed between this reflex theory and behaviorist psychology. Mm-hmm. So the notion that ultimately what we're doing when we behave is sort of forming predictable responses to these sensory inputs. You can see how there's a psychology version of that. So as Pavlov described, the dog that salivates to food and then you condition it and it salivates to the bell as well. What you're looking for is this very tight connection between a sensory input and a behavioral output. So that behavioral level is in psychology is being paralleled with this neural level within the physiology.
So in the context of the thesis you present in the book, what would you say reflex theory is illustrative of exactly?
Yeah, so I'm using it, if you like, as a cautionary tale to say that if you want to explain why scientists were so attracted to this theory, even though looking at it in retrospect, it seems so vastly oversimplified that how you ask yourself, how could anyone have been convinced that this could be true? How could anyone think that everything that's going on in the brain will just boil down to sensory motor reflexes? What I'm saying is it illustrates how alluring, how compelling the goal of simplicity can be. So once scientists are just trying to find the simplest theory, they can be misled into believing in a theory that in retrospect must be completely wrong. And so then you have to ask, well, what in science today might people be convinced by because they so want to believe in the simplicity that they ignore all of the reasons for thinking, well, this couldn't possibly be true.
So after reflex theory, of course, came the rise of the idea that neural processes that give rise to cognition are essentially computational. So what does it mean for something to be computational, specifically the brain or neural processes? What does computational mean exactly?
Yeah, I mean, computational theory is a branch of mathematics which is to do with what functions are. So a function in mathematics is a fixed relationship between an input and an output. So addition, the function, if you for any two numbers or more numbers, the addition function maps that onto a specific answer, which is the sum of those numbers. So you can think of a computation as describing this process that gets you from the input to the output, as described by the mathematical function. So in the context of neuroscience, saying that the brain or an individual neuron even is computational is saying that what it's doing is it's taking inputs and converting them in a rule-governed way to an output, the rule-governed way defined by the function. And so this idea of transferring computational ideas to neuroscience happened very early in the history of the invention of computers. So, if you think of, the digital computer based on Alan Turing's ideas, they were developed during the war, Second World War. And it was actually in 1943 with McCulloch and Pitts, this notion that individual neurons could be computational devices was first proposed. So they thought that the dendrites of the neurons, the parts of the neurons which standardly taken just to receive like inputs from another neuron around them. What this actually means in the concrete world is just that the dendrites of the neurons are sensitive to neurotransmitters that are coming from previous neurons, and this modulates the electrical excitability of this neuron that is receiving that neurotransmitter. But the thought was, okay, that you have these dendrons, they're the input end, the body of the neuron performs a computation, and this converts the signal on the output end, which will then go and affect other neurons in the network. So saying that that's how you can say that an individual neuron is computational if you just take those notions of input, output, and function, connecting them, and sort of impose that template onto neurophysiology. But if you're thinking of the brain as a whole being computational, people would think in terms of like all of our sensory systems being the inputs. We're taking data from the world. In the center of our brains, we're performing this operation that converts those inputs into a certain output. So the output would be motor signals, which shows what behavior is. So when I'm talking, that's possible because my brain is sending signals to my voice box, and so if you like, all behavior sort of ultimately is this motor output.
So in the case of computational models of the brain, are we working with an analogy here or not?
Yeah, so I'm arguing that it's an analogy. I point out, though, that the dominant view, I'd say, amongst neuroscientists themselves and many people that do philosophy of neuroscience, says that the brain literally is a computer. It's not just an analogy or a comparison that one could make, but they're saying that inherently the brain is a computational device. What I'm arguing instead is that no, for reasons to do with what I talked about before, that it's useful for scientists to think about biological organs in terms of tools that people have made. That gives them if you like, a way in to try and thinking about how the biological organ might work. So I'm saying for that reason, people have been very attracted to the comparison between brains and computers, not least because computers were designed in order to do tasks which people use their brains for, to do cognitive tasks. So Turing's vision of what a computer was originally was to replace the human computer. So the digital computer was simply performing the tasks done by a human computer. And what a human computer did, this is a job that was taken over by AI back in the day. All computers are a kind of artificial intelligence. It was just doing sums all day. So we have people used to be the only kinds of things that could do sums all day. Now we have machines doing that. So the thought was, well, there's a similarity in what computers and brains can do. Let's see if we can understand the brains as biological computers. And so I'm saying, well, given the functional similarity in some respects between brains and computers, it's a natural thing to do. There's nothing wrong with this strategy in itself, but we shouldn't just literally think that what brains essentially do is just the same thing as what digital computers essentially do.
But do you think there are still ways by which the analogy can be scientifically useful or not?
Yeah, so I think most analogies in science can be shown to have their uses. One way to think about why it's useful, I like this Mary Hesse's notion of domestication. So if you think of the things in nature, they're kind of wild and not obvious in how they work. A tool is something very domestic to people in the sense that people have made it and makes sense to them. So what these analogies are doing is looking at what's unfamiliar through the lens of something that is familiar and makes sense. So that certainly gives scientists a way to not be overwhelmed by just the opacity, the just the alien nature of what they're trying to investigate. In the chapter in the book, I look at this sort of historically about sort of this early research that was done on that interface between computer science and neuroscience and that whole cybernetics movement. And the thought was that, okay, we look at the nervous system, we've got no idea how motor control happens, but what if we build a robot that does some of the things that are like what a person does when they are behaving with motor control? At least we've got a clue, or like the beginnings of a theory about what might be happening neurophysiologically. Of course, analogies can be misleading because every analogy is based on a partial similarity but not identity. So two objects related by analogy will be similar in some ways but also different in many ways. And my criticism of the computational framework, when people interpret it literally, is that it tempts them just to ignore the differences between biological brains and artificial computing machines.
And of course, since we're talking about simplification in science here, we also have to talk a little bit about modeling, because that's also something that scientists do, something that is, I guess, fundamental in science. So in the case of cognitive neuroscience specifically, how do you look at the relationship between modeling techniques and experimental practice, for example?
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book which sort of focuses specifically on this theme, and it's making the argument that models, all models simplify, and that famous slogan by George Box, all models are false, but some are useful. So all models, he says, are false because they all simplify, right? No model can just take in all of the complexity that's there observably. But I'm saying the most effective modeling strategies don't just begin at the modeling stage. It's really important how you generate the data in order to get a nice tractable model out of it. So I'm talking a lot about the experimental techniques that have been used in neurophysiology of the visual system. So this is work on primary visual cortex going from the 1950s onwards. How scientists were really careful about how they prepared their animals, sort of use of different behavioral restraints, something mostly as drastic as anesthesia in the early stages, really careful about how they chose their stimuli. A lot of these techniques had the precise effect of making data sets which had less variance than they would do if you just recorded from the activity in neurons just in uncontrolled viewing conditions. So when a cat is sort of roaming around a park, jumping around, hunting, doing all kinds of things, it's very hard. You're going to get a data set which is very hard to model because there'll be very little repeatability of responses from one time to the next. If you anesthetize the cat, put it in a harness, basically stop it having any kind of cognitive activity pretty much other than the precise stimulus that you've chose to make it view, then you're going to get neurophysiological responses which are kind of consistent with mapping from particular stimulus to particular activity profile. There's still actually a lot of variance, but it's going to be way less than if you just approach things in the wild. So just the variability of neuroscientists to have data sets which then they could build models of was dependent on all of this experimental methodology that happened in the first place. Though we talk about how with current technologies using machine learning and very, very wide sampling of neurons when they're recorded in the brain, people are actually trying to develop data sets which are more naturalistic, so more like how the primary visual cortex would work if the cat is jumping around the park as opposed to anesthetized in the lab. And that is leading to interesting classes of new models which kind of fall down, I suppose, on this question of intelligibility of the model, because you can find mathematical relationships in these very, very high dimensional data sets, but that ability for the scientist to actually say, aha, I've figured out the operating principles of this system, that gets reduced once you're dealing with data sets of such complexity.
So another very important topic here has to do with representation. And I've already had on the show people like Doctors Randall Beer and Luis Favela,
yeah.
and we did entire interviews, almost 2-hour interviews, just on the topic of computational representational approaches to neuroscience and dynamical systems theory. We're also going to get into that in a second. But how do you approach the topic of representations? I mean, what are representations, and where exactly is the role that you see they play in brain research?
Yeah, so the question, what are representations? I mean, there's philosophers that just spend their whole career just on that question. So it's not actually my area of expertise, so I'm not going to go into like a technical definition or give you the different views on that in terms of a debate. In how I like to think about it as a philosopher of science here is to think about, well, how are scientists using this notion of representation? Clearly what they're doing is sort of drawing from uncontroversial cases of representation that are familiar from everyday life. So if you think about, what a map is, it's a kind of representation. It's standing in for the territory which is out there in a city, and just taking some of the structural features of that territory and depicting them in the map so that the person has, if you like, a substitute for the experience of walking around the whole city. You can see a subset of those relationships there in the map, and it allows you to do certain tasks like plan a route through a town. All language is representational. When I talk about a dog or a cat, there's no dog or cat in the room, but if I say those words, then you're able to refer to the same item as me. Paintings and all kinds of things can be representations in everyday life. A core philosophical term that goes with the study of representations is this notion of intentionality. It's this idea that a representation is a physical object, which this notion of intentionality literally comes from the idea of it reaching out to the world around it, to some object that it's aiming to depict. So this is the feature of representations that I'm arguing is particularly important with the use of this notion of neural representation. So what I'm saying is that when neuroscientists say that activity in parts of the visual cortex represents certain things, like it might represent a face, what the neuroscientist is drawing on is this comparison between, say, a picture which might represent a face. Not because maybe that's not such a good example, because a picture has this kind of structural similarity with a face. So it would be better to say it's like a word which might be used to represent a face, or a sentence which might represent a face. So even though the sentence is not similar to a face, if you know the language, you'll be able to decode the sentence and have conveyed in front of you information about the face. So if I say, the Mona Lisa had a face with an enigmatic smile and she had long brown hair, you'll be decoding this sentence, you'll know something about that face. So the idea would be, a neural activation in part of the fusiform face area is representing a face because there is a neural code which describes properties of that face. It sort of reaches out into the world around it. Instead of just being about electrical activity, it's actually about that face in the world. That notion of intentionality comes in. This is all an account of why neuroscientists think about neural activations in terms of representation. An obvious point to make here is that representations are central to how people cognize. It's a central explanatory notion in cognitive science. So if you say that there are representations in the brain, then you have this bridge from neurophysiology to cognition, because you're saying like how the brain allows us to cognize the world is that the brain already forms representations. Therefore, we can start explaining how cognition is possible on that psychological level. So that's like something that many people have said about why neuroscientists talk about representation. I say furthermore that it's also a simplifying strategy, because it permits scientists to really focus on the relationship between an activation in a particular brain area and objects in the world that those neurons are sensitive to, and ignoring lots of biological details about how those activations get caused.
So getting into the topic of computational/representational approaches to neuroscience and then dynamical systems theory approaches, in the book you take the example of the motor cortex and how it functions and its nature and the different ways people have approached it. So what would be then the common computational representational approach to it, and then the dynamical systems approach to the motor cortex?
Yeah, so the computational representational approach, it's a bit earlier in its origins. And what that says is that for motor cortex, which is like strip it around the top of your head, its role is to direct movement, so sending signals to the spinal cord, which ultimately cause your muscles to move. And so the theory about it being representational was to say that neural activations in this motor cortex are representing movements that you intend to make. So there is this, if you like, one-to-one correspondence between an activation here and a particular movement like raising your arm. And so that was a theory put forward for the explanation of how motor cortex supports motor control, because you simply represents your motor intentions in the brain, and then that signals to your body to move in certain ways. A bit of an obstacle for that theory came about through findings of like relative instability of the relationship between these neural activations and movements. So people sort of trying hard in under controlled experimental situations to see, okay, what particular movement does this neuron serve? Is it what is it exactly representing? Even is it representing like whole arm moves? Is it representing the velocity of the arm movement? Is it representing the activation of certain muscles? Is it doing that consistently from one trial to another? It was very hard to pin anything down on this. Everything seemed to be a bit jelly-like. Yeah, there's a clear relationship between motor cortex activity and muscle movements, but actually being precise on what that relationship was became quite hard to theorize. So in the purist version, the dynamical systems approach, and this is there's an influential paper by Krishna Shenoy and Mark Churchland and some other authors. They describe a dynamical systems approach which sort of doesn't say that what the motor cortex is doing is representing any movement parameters. They're just saying this is a dynamical system which, if you like, causally drives motor outputs. So they have a different theory about the relationship between the activity and the movement outputs. They say it's a kind of a pattern generator. They say this kind of cyclical rhythmic activity in motor cortex, which you can describe using dynamical equations. This is, if you like, giving lots of movement templates to the rest of the body, which is just causally driven by these activity patterns. So in that paper, they are describing the dynamical systems approach and the computational representational one as being incompatible, but there's other theorists, and Randy Beer has written some interesting stuff relevant to this that actually say, no, these are just two different perspectives on the same thing. For any object in the world, you can, certainly in a object in cognitive science, you can describe it as computational representation or dynamical systems theory, or as a dynamical system, and they're not ultimately incompatible. So there's people, I think John Krakauer has argued this with respect to Hopfield networks, so artificial neural networks can also be described as dynamical systems, and you can sort of think of these as doing computations and also doing this whole dynamical causally driving thing as well.
That's very interesting. And I've noticed in my interviews also that there are different views on how compatible these two different sets of approaches are. Some people think that they are really incompatible. Others are more on the side of compatibility. But if they are compatible, what does that tell us about how we understand and study the brain? Because I mean, the question here is if we can have a correct or an approximation to an understanding of the brain through two different sets of theories. I mean, what does that tell us? I mean, because shouldn't it be just one theory that would be correct here? Or
yeah. So this goes back to this question of pluralism. So if you insist on incompatibility, one of the things you're assuming in the background is that one of these theories is getting essentially at the truth of how the brain operates, and the other theory is false. I'm saying that both of these theories make simplifications in their own way, which depart from ultimately the truth, the ground truth of how the brain operates. So if you think of the classical computational representational one, it's making assumptions about the consistency of the neuronal what the neurons are intending to represent. That's not true. That kind of stability is not true of the actual brain. If you take the dynamical systems approach, it's making assumptions about there's ultimately some sort of fixed laws of motor behavior. That might not be true, but that's fine if you're saying with me that all scientific theories are simplified in some ways, and like all models, they have to depart from the inherent complexity of the system. So it's sort of an option for me to say, well, they're compatible because they are both perspectives on this one thing. They simplify in different ways. None of them are allowing you to discover like the whole truth of how the motor cortex works. So what I say in the end of that chapter on the motor cortex research is that ultimately we have to have this sort of intellectual humility, this Kantian humility, which says that the thing in itself, or the brain in itself, because of its inherent and irreducible complexity, is to some extent cognitively, epistemically inaccessible to us. We can't have that ideal of full and complete, absolute, once and forever theory of motor cortex which will just tell us everything that there is to know about it. We have to accept that all of our theoretical approaches will be limited in different and perhaps complementary ways, but yeah, the final complete theory of the brain in itself is not going to be available.
And of course, nowadays we also have machine learning as a way of modeling and studying different, not just neural processes, neural systems, but other aspects of reality. What would you say are the pros and cons of using this kind of methods?
Yeah, so I got interested in machine learning methods in neuroscience just because I began to see how much of neuroscience was changing because of the developments in machine learning. So my home area of neuroscience is actually vision science, and I grew up with learning and modeling visual responses with these mathematically very, almost trivially simple equations. And there were limitations in what kinds of responses could be predicted with these quite simple models. So my own research, modeling, we could predict the responses of how people sensitivity would change to contrast of black and white stripy patterns. But if you took black and white photographs, our models would have less predictive value. So what happened with the machine learning revolution, and this was kind of following on like big advances in machine vision, you know, object recognition, face recognition, at the start of this century, suddenly started to be achieved. What happened is that like, vision researchers in neuroscience were looking at deep learning and saying, aha, these computers are doing vision. What can we learn about the visual system from studying these kinds of devices? And it turns out what you can do is you can build very, very vast, like million parameter models of visual cortex, which allow you to predict the responses of neurons to almost a complete array of different stimulus types. But then what you find is that the theoretical payoff in terms of understanding how visual cortex is working is more limited, at least in the mathematical details of what you're studying, because in the old theories, the old strategies, you had a few equations and you could tell a story about, okay, this kind of function is an edge detector and this feeds into this other thing, right? Whereas when you have a vast, deep convolutional neural network, which you're using to model visual cortex, you can say a few things like there's X number of layers and there's certain connectivity types between the two, and this may or may not correspond to what you see in the actual brain, but mathematically it tells you, I would say, less about what's going on. Other people might disagree with this. I mean, this is something, I'm just stating my own position. There are people like, people that have argued that there's much more theoretically and explanatorily available with using deep learning methods in science. So anyway, it's an ongoing debate that's being had.
Since we're on the topic of AI, how do you think we should deal with the claims regarding the potential of AI systems developing, or I mean, perhaps programming them even with things like consciousness, general intelligence, and perhaps this would be a way of also connecting the discussion to the idea of multiple realizability of cognition here, right? So in your view, what should we make of those types of claims?
So this is going back to an argument that springs out of what we were talking about before with the computer brain analogy. So I said before that we need to pay as much attention to the differences between computing machines and brains as to the similarities which this analogy points us towards. People who sort of are literal about the brain being a kind of computer, what they're claiming is that the similarity, if like the overlap in properties between brains and computers, is what's essential to how the brain serves cognition. So anything cognitively going on in the brain, and this includes consciousness, will ultimately have a computational explanation, if you like. There ultimately is an algorithm that we run in our brains, which is what makes us conscious. So if you think like that, given that digital computation is medium independent, so you can in principle run any algorithm on any physical hardware. In practice you might not be able to, but in principle the material that a computer is made of is irrelevant to its ability to perform a computation. That gives you, if you buy into this view, then you're going to think, well, if consciousness is just the product of an algorithm running, a machine could be built that is consciousness in the same way that I have. So you see this in people that talk about uploading. They say, if we record from enough neurons in our brain, and if you mathematically model their responses, then in principle, my mind could be uploaded onto the cloud, because it's just an algorithm, and I just need to discover the algorithm, and then I could have my own conscious mind after my body has died, but my mind will still be operating in this cloud-based platform. So that, you use the term multiple realization. That's another way of talking about medium independence. It's saying that any algorithm can be realized or implemented in a wide array of material substrates. But my conjecture is that people have been misled into these kinds of views because they haven't paid enough attention to what's different between brains and computers. There's good evidence coming from the biological side of neuroscience, which looks at cell physiology in its details, neurochemistry in its details, all these things going on with glial cells and genetic and immunological responses that I could also mention here, that says that what's going on in the brain making cognition possible is inherently connected with a whole bunch of other biological processes which are happening, which are in no way shared with computing machines. So computers like this one we're using now are obviously not living things. They don't have any of the metabolic, immunological, other features that brains have. So if cognition is inherently dependent on this, if consciousness is possible because we have all of these biological features, then we shouldn't expect a non-living machine to run consciousness.
I mean, about the physiology of the brain, the metabolism and immunology and all of that, would you also add here perhaps some aspects coming from embodied cognition and the fact that the nervous system, at least in biological systems, also operates within a body, and so we also have to consider the rest of the body? I mean, would that also play a role here in why probably artificial systems wouldn't be able to develop the same kinds of capacities?
Yeah. So that's an important way of thinking about it. So by embodied cognition, what we're led to pay attention to is the way that neuroscience specializes and treats the brain and nervous system independently of the rest of the body is itself an idealization. It's a simplifying strategy. It's like carving out one system to examine independently of its context. And for reasons we talked about before, like there's too much complexity in the world to try and take in everything at once. So, standard practice in the biological sciences is to research one organ at a time, if not one cell type at a time. But we know through other observations, and more of this research is happening, often prompted by medical research, is that the operation of the nervous system is deeply interconnected with operations in the rest of the body. So this gut-brain connection is being focused on intensively in research now because of the connection between the brain and metabolism and appetite and all of these things. So people are realizing that if you want to develop a drug which will help people lose weight, you have to pay attention to that gut-brain connection. The gut itself is hugely innervated. There's lots and lots of neurons around the gut, and they're all obviously in contact with the brain. The same for the heart. The whole nervous system around the heart is really important to operations there. And then conversely, all of the ways that the immune system and other bodily systems affect how the brain operates. So ultimately, the philosophical position of embodied cognition says that it's sort of, if you like, an anti-dualist, anti-Cartesian way. It's a way of thinking. It says that there's been too much of this view that cognition is this thing like kind of floats above the rest of the body, like a pure immaterial soul. That's what Descartes said. Actually, what cognition is something very inherent to what is going on with the body being, as I just said, this living system, that we don't understand cognition properly unless we understand it as being a capacity of a living body.
Would you also include the other three E's of 4E cognition here? I mean, also the embedded, extended, and enacted aspects of it.
Yeah, so yeah, these views are often taken as a package, and I'm pretty sympathetic to it. To the other ones, I talk more about the embodied cognition. I'd say the inactive, yeah, I mean, there's details of the inactivism theory that I wouldn't sign up for in terms of all perception being to do with sensory motor contingencies. I think that one of the E's that I have an attachment to is the ecological theories. In my previous book on colour, I was developing an ecological theory of what it is to have colour perception. The extended E, that is a tricky one, because there's actually, as Andy Clark wrote about in this nice paper called Pressing the Flesh, there's actually an incompatibility between the most thorough versions of the embodied and the extended cognition. So as I was just saying, with the embodied cognition, you're really emphasizing the medium dependence of cognition, that it really matters that it happens in a living body. Whereas the extended mind says that cognition can occur in these body tool hybrid systems, these cyborgs, or it could even like go out into non-biological territory. And that's pretty much saying that the medium doesn't matter because it can extend out into these non-living systems. So I have to say, given that I'm quite keen on the embodied side, I'm less keen on the extended bit.
No, that's very interesting, because in my conversation with Dr. Randall Beer, he said more or less the same. He's not very fond of the extended bit of the 4E cognition framework. And by the way, Dr. Luis Favela also recently put out a book, The Ecological Brain, talking about the ecological bit that you mentioned there. So I also have an interview on that on the show if people are interested. And so one last question then, and since you are a philosopher yourself, I mean, you approach things from the perspective of a philosopher here, keeping in mind the main thesis that you develop in your book about simplifying schemas in neuroscience. How do you look at the relationship between science and philosophy, and how should they, what kinds of, I don't know, insights should they bring to the table when it comes to dealing with these aspects of theorizing, modeling, and so on in science? And what do you think are the roles that they can play here?
So this goes back to the question that we started out on, and I said a few things about neurophilosophy there, and how I think there's an unaddressed problem about the way that philosophers have tried to draw on scientific results. So once we have in mind all of these different ways that science is simplified, can it really answer the questions that naturalistically inclined philosophers, neurophilosophers, have tried to make it speak to in their own research? So I'm sort of raising this as a question that I hope other people working in this area will address. It would be great if people that are really committed to neurophilosophy sort of develop a response to this worry that I'm raising, because I'm sure there are ways to address it and respond to this. It's just, it's not a conversation that I've seen happen yet, and I want to start that conversation. The position that I end up advocating is one that says there are reasons for philosophy of mind to carry on as an autonomous discipline as well. So there's been, and I think this is something that I would accuse neurophilosophy of, certainly a scientistic drift to the way people have approached this. So by scientistic, what I mean is just assuming that the scientific methodology and approach is uniquely the one that is going to yield the answers that any of the answers that you might have about the questions that you have on a topic. So it sort of gives a preeminence to those methodologies. And that's the reason why neurophilosophers have said to other philosophers of mine, you need to give up your old armchair way of doing philosophy that ignores the science, because that's obsolete now. There's no room for those methodologies that are disconnected from science. And that's the conclusion that I'm pushing back against, because I think if we take seriously how much idealization there is in science, you have these worries about the scientists might be assuming things about the subject matter of the mind, especially human mind, its place in society, which are incompatible with the views that you might be really important to you as a philosopher, and you should operate autonomously from the science when it is committed to an idealization that you yourself as a philosopher see good reason to reject. So one idealization you could think about here is the lack of normativity that is included in research on scientific research on cognition, by which I mean research on cognition abstracts away from value and normativity. It doesn't see that as an inherent part of its subject matter that it wants to investigate. Whereas normativity and values, it's central to how philosophers need to theorize topics in philosophy of mind related to decision-making, will, all these kinds of things where we have a human stake in it, which means that value and normativity are important. So if that's what you're interested in as a philosopher, that's what you see as important to you, then you've got good reason to be wary of importing results from the science, which has assumed at the outset that value and normativity are not relevant. And it's done that because if you include all those variables to do with value and normativity, you end up with too much to deal with scientifically. So that's an argument for the autonomy of philosophy from certain scientific research projects, but also sort of consistent with this anti-scientistic conclusion, it does open the door to philosophy collaborating with other disciplines. So I said before, well, literature, its use of metaphors, maybe that's a way of thinking about the world that opens the door to being aware of greater complexity and interdependence, and maybe philosophers should be paying attention to those other modes of thinking, those other cultural discourses, as much as they have been in recent years paying attention to scientific results. So ultimately, it's a very pluralist and open open position. But I think, like, given the importance of neurophilosophy to our discipline, it might, to some people, seem a very controversial or a strange view to take.
I was also smiling when you were mentioning scientism. I mean, using that word, and also how certain neurophilosophers talk about the armchair philosophers and look a little bit down on them, because I was remembering my first interview with Dr. Patricia Churchland, which I will probably also link in the description, to have sort of an opposing view on all of these kinds of topics, which is also interesting. And again, the book is The Brain Abstracted, Simplification, and in the History and Philosophy of Neuroscience. I'm leaving also a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Chirimuuta, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, I'm kind of an internet decliner these days. So I'm not on any social media, and that makes it hard to sell books these days. So I'm glad to have an interview like this. But no, I do have a website. It's called outsidecolor.net. So all of my papers are linked to there. So you can find a bunch of papers that are related to this, and there's some more detailed stuff in the history of philosophy that I've done, as well, and history of neuroscience. There's various lectures that I've done which are on YouTube, so if you search my name, you'll be able to find a bunch of stuff there. I was talking about various topics, including the history of computation and how that's related to social economic factors. That's one of my favorite ones there. I think it's called Contextualizing the Computational Mind. Yeah, and where else do I exist on the web? Not much, but I do answer emails actually, because I'm not on social media. If people just email me with a reasonable question out of the blue, I do make every effort to respond, because I just actually like that old-fashioned thing of like communicating between actual people, as opposed to just sort of broadcasting my ideas on social media. And also I don't like my own thought process to be too much algorithmically driven. And you can judge from the book itself whether that is a good strategy or not.
No, for sure, for sure. And look, I really loved the book. It was a fantastic read for me, at least, and I really hope that people in the audience also run and buy it. It's a great book. So thank you so much.
I should also mention that there is an open access version that's been made available by MIT Press. So the PDF is available to download, and maybe I shouldn't say that because that might affect book sales. But yeah, you for people that don't want to buy the hard copy, you can still read it.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been great to talk with you.
Oh, thank you, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.